The Montana sky was a hard, endless blue, stretched tight over peaks that tore at it with teeth of granite and ice. Winter had come early to the territory in this year of 1876, dusting the high country with a sugar-fine snow that promised a bitter season. Down in the valleys, rivers churned with a cold, gray fury, their roar a constant reminder of nature's raw power. The wind, a lonely traveler, moaned through the lodgepole pines, carrying the distant, hungry cries of a wolf pack. This was a land that did not love a man. It tolerated him, and only if he was strong enough to endure its unforgiving moods. High on a ridge overlooking the small, huddled town of Bighorn Ridge, a thin ribbon of smoke rose from a stone chimney. It was the only sign of human life for miles. The smoke came from the cabin of Elias McCrae. To the people below, he was not a man with a name. He was the mountain man, a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered to children who stayed out after dusk. He lived as the mountains did, silent, weathered, and alone. His solitude was a fortress he had built stone by stone over 10 long years. The walls were the scars that mapped his body. They twisted down the left side of his face, pulling the corner of his mouth into a permanent, grim line, and leaving the skin around his eye a web of puckered, discolored flesh. The fire had taken more than his skin. It had taken his youth, his family, and his place in the world. He had been a boy of 20, strong and full of promise, with a laugh that came easy. Now, at 30, his voice was a low rasp, rusty from disuse, and his eyes held the haunted, watchful look of a cornered animal. The folks in Bighorn Ridge filled his silence with their own dark stories. Some said he had set the fire himself, murdering his own brother, Thomas, in a fit of jealousy over the family ranch. Others, more pious, claimed the fire was God's judgment, a mark of Cain for some unspoken sin. They saw the beast in his scars and never bothered to look for the man beneath. Elias did nothing to correct them. Their fear was a shield. He descended from his mountain perch only when necessity demanded it, his large frame wrapped in thick furs, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He would tether his horse at the edge of town and walk to the general store, his heavy footfalls echoing on the boardwalk. The whispers would die. Mothers would pull their children close, and men would stop their talk to stare. He would buy flour, salt, coffee, and ammunition. His words clipped and few, his money laid carefully on the counter. Then he would turn and walk away, leaving the town to its frightened gossip, and retreat back to the silence of his mountain. It was to this town, this place of hard edges and quiet suspicion, that Clara Hayes arrived on a creaking, mud-splattered stagecoach. She stepped down onto the dusty street, a small, solitary figure in a plain wool traveling coat, her face pale and her eyes shadowed with a grief that was still too new, too raw. St. Louis, with its gaslights and society and suffocating memories, was 1,000 miles and a lifetime behind her. She had fled the city after the scandal broke, after her husband, Arthur, had taken his own life, leaving behind a mountain of gambling debts and a reputation stained beyond repair. Clara, his widow, was left with nothing but the whispers that followed her everywhere, the pitying looks that felt like accusations. She had seen an advertisement for a schoolteacher in Bighorn Ridge, Montana territory. It sounded like the edge of the world, a place far enough away to bury her past and begin again, or at least to be alone with her sorrow. The town did not welcome her with open arms. It looked her over with a cold, assessing curiosity. Her clothes, though simple, were too fine. Her speech was too soft. She was an outsider, a city woman with a story she was clearly not telling. She took a room at the boarding house run by a stern, hawk-nosed woman named Mrs. Gable, whose questions were as sharp and pointed as her chin. Clara answered them vaguely, offering only that she was a widow seeking quiet work. It was not enough to satisfy the town's hunger for gossip, but it was all she was willing to give. The schoolhouse was a one-room log building with a potbelly stove and 12 students of varying ages and levels of cleanliness. Teaching them their letters and sums gave her a purpose, a reason to rise each morning. But the work could not fill the vast, echoing emptiness of her life. The children were wary of her at first, their gazes lingering on her sad eyes. The townspeople were polite but distant. At church on Sundays, she sat alone in a back pew, the minister's sermon about sin and redemption feeling like a personal indictment. The loneliness was a physical ache, a cold weight in her chest that grew heavier with each passing day. She had come here seeking solitude, but she had not understood how sharp its teeth could be. In late November, the promised bitter season arrived in full force. A storm rolled in from the north, a great, gray beast of a thing that swallowed the mountains and buried the valley in a blinding swirl of white. The wind shrieked like a banshee, piling snow into monstrous drifts against buildings and fences. For 2 days, the world was nothing but wind and snow. On the third day, the storm seemed to break. The wind lessened, and a pale, watery sun appeared for a few hours. Clara, desperate to escape the confines of her small room and the suffocating silence of the town, decided to deliver some overdue lessons and a small sack of flour to the Miller family. Their homestead was 5 miles up the mountain trail, and their 2 youngest children had been home with lung fever for a week. Mrs. Gable warned against it. "That trail's no place for a lady, especially not now. The snow's deep and the weather's a fickle thing in these mountains." But Clara was possessed by a restless need to do something, to be useful. The Millers were poor, and she knew they would be grateful for the supplies. "I will be careful," she insisted, bundling herself in every layer of wool she owned. "I will be back before dark." She rented a small buckboard wagon and a sturdy horse from the livery. The first 2 miles were difficult but manageable. The trail was a narrow track cut into the mountainside, and the snow was deeper than she had anticipated. The air was thin and bit at her exposed cheeks, but the stark, white beauty of the wilderness was breathtaking. The snow-laden pines stood like silent, solemn sentinels, and the quiet was absolute. For a moment, she felt a sense of peace she had not known in months. Then the sky began to change. The pale sun vanished, and the clouds descended, thick and gray as dirty wool. The wind picked up again, not with a moan, but with a vicious, rising howl. The snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a thick, horizontal torrent that stung her eyes and stole her breath. Within minutes, she could not see more than a few feet in front of the horse. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of white. The horse, spooked by the wind and the blinding snow, grew agitated. It shied at a dark shape, a fallen log buried in a drift, and the right wheel of the buckboard plunged into a deep rut hidden beneath the snow. There was a sharp crack of splintering wood. The wagon lurched violently, throwing Clara from her seat into a deep bank of snow. The axle was broken. The terrified horse, its harness snapped, bolted into the white chaos and disappeared. Clara lay in the snow for a moment, stunned, the wind screaming in her ears. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her shock. She scrambled to her feet, sinking to her thighs in the powder. "Hello?" she called out, her voice immediately snatched away by the gale. "Is anyone there?" There was no answer but the relentless howl of the wind. She was alone. She did not know whether it was better to try to go forward to the Miller homestead or back to town. She could see nothing in either direction. She chose the way back, reasoning it was downhill. She began to walk, her long skirts dragging in the snow, each step a monumental effort. The cold was a living thing, seeping through her coat and boots, sinking its teeth into her bones. Her feet and hands went numb first. Then the shivering started, a violent, uncontrollable trembling that shook her whole body. Time lost all meaning. There was only the struggle to lift one frozen leg after another, the burning in her lungs, the deafening roar of the storm. Her mind began to drift. She thought of Arthur, of the warmth of their first year of marriage. before the darkness had taken hold of him. She thought of her mother's garden in St. Louis, of the scent of roses on a summer afternoon. These warm, golden memories were a cruel torture in the frozen hell she now inhabited. The shivering eventually stopped, replaced by a strange and dangerous lethargy. She knew, in a distant, detached part of her mind, that this was a bad sign. She knew she should keep moving, but the desire to simply lie down, to close her eyes and rest in the soft, white silence, was overwhelmingly seductive. She stumbled one last time and did not have the strength to get up. She curled into a small ball in the snow, the wind piling a white shroud over her. This is where it ends, she thought, not with a bang, but with a slow, quiet freezing. Her last conscious thought was of the irony. She had come to the wilderness to escape the ghosts of her past, only to be claimed by the wilderness itself. Elias McCrae was checking his trap lines when the storm returned. He had felt it coming in the ache of his bones and the scent of the air. He was moving through the trees, a hulking shape almost indistinguishable from the landscape, when he saw it, the dark, broken shape of the buckboard. It was a foreign object in his world, an intrusion. He approached it cautiously. He saw the broken axle, the single set of tracks leading away from it, already half filled with new snow. A fool. Only a fool would be on this trail in this weather. His first instinct was to turn back, to ignore it. It was not his business. The mountain took who it took. But something stayed his feet. He had seen the wagon at the livery in town. He remembered the livery owner, a man named Jedediah, mentioning the new schoolteacher. A woman, alone. A curse escaped his lips, a plume of white in the frigid air. He was a man who had made a religion of minding his own affairs, of staying separate, but to leave a woman to die in the snow, even he was not that much of a monster. With a deep, weary sigh that seemed to rise from the soles of his feet, he followed the tracks. He found her less than a quarter of a mile away. She was a small, dark mound, almost completely buried. He brushed the snow from her face. It was chalky white, tinged with blue at the lips. For a moment, he thought he was too late. He pressed his fingers against her neck, fumbling with his numb digits. He felt it then, a flicker of a pulse, faint and thready. But there, she was alive. He lifted her from the snow. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight in his powerful arms. Her head lolled against his chest. He adjusted his hold, pulling her deeper into the warmth of his bearskin coat, and turned toward his cabin. The trek was grueling, even for him. The wind fought him every step of the way, trying to tear her from his grasp. He bent his head, his scarred face set in a grim mask of determination, and pushed on. Clara drifted back to consciousness slowly, as if surfacing from a deep, dark body of water. The first thing she was aware of was warmth, a heavy, profound warmth that seemed to be radiating from a fire and wrapping her in its embrace. She was lying on something soft, a bed of furs, and she was covered with a thick wool blanket. The air smelled of wood smoke, pine, and something else, something musky and male. She heard the crackle of a fire and the continued howl of the wind outside, a sound that was now a comfort, a reminder that she was sheltered from it. She tried to open her eyes. Her lids felt heavy as lead. When she finally managed it, the world was a blur of shadow and orange light. A fire was roaring in a large stone hearth. The cabin was small, a single room, rustic and spare. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. Shelves holding tins and jars lined one wall, and in the corner, sitting on a stool, was a man. He was a giant, his frame filling the small space, his back to her as he tended to something at the hearth. He turned, and her breath caught in her throat. The firelight played over the left side of his face, illuminating a landscape of ruined flesh. The scars were a terrifying testament to some past violence, pulling his features into a fearsome grimace. It was him, the mountain man, the murderer, the monster from the town's whispers. A strangled cry escaped her lips. His head snapped up, and his eyes, a startlingly pale gray, met hers. They were not cruel eyes. They were wary, watchful, and filled with a deep, ancient weariness. He stood up, and she flinched, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. Terror, primal and absolute, seized her. She had been saved from the storm only to be captured by a beast. He did not move closer. He simply stood there, a great, looming shadow against the fire. His voice, when it came, was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to shake the very floorboards. "You are safe from the storm." He took a step toward the bed, holding a steaming mug. She shrank back. "Do not be afraid," he said, his voice rough. He stopped, seeing her fear. He placed the mug on a small crate beside the bed. "Broth, you need it." She stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was nothing like she had imagined, and yet everything, the size of him, the scars, they were terrifying. But there was a stillness about him, a quiet that was not menacing. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace. He saw her glance down at her hands and feet. "The frost was not deep," he said. "You will lose no fingers." He had taken her boots and stockings off. Her feet were wrapped in clean strips of cloth. He had saved her. This man, this feared outcast, had carried her through a blizzard and brought her to his home. The knowledge was a dizzying contradiction to everything she had been told. He retreated to the far side of the cabin, giving her space, and busied himself with cleaning a rifle, his large hands surprisingly deft. The silence stretched between them, thick and awkward. She was terrified of him, and he seemed utterly unaccustomed to company, especially the company of a woman. Finally, she found her voice, though it was a mere whisper. "Thank you." He grunted in response, not looking up from his work. I am Clara Hayes, the new school teacher." "I know who you are," he said, his tone flat. He set the rifle aside. "Stay. The storm will not pass before morning. Then you go." His words were not a suggestion. They were a command. He was offering her shelter, not welcome. She could see the tension in his broad shoulders, the way he held himself apart. Her presence here was a disturbance, a violation of his solitude. And yet, when he had brought her the broth, when he had spoken of her frostbite, she had seen something beneath the gruffness. His hands, though calloused and scarred themselves, had wrapped her feet with a surprising gentleness. She drank the broth. It was hot and savory, and it sent a wave of life-giving warmth through her chilled body. She lay back against the furs, exhausted but no longer on the verge of death. She watched him as he moved about the small cabin, stoking the fire, checking the latch on the door. He was a man sealed off from the world, a fortress unto himself. She, too, felt like a fortress, one whose walls had been breached and left in ruins. Sleep eventually claimed her, a deep, healing sleep born of utter exhaustion. When she woke again, the gray light of dawn was filtering through a single, grimy window pane. The storm had lessened. The wind no longer shrieked, but moaned a low, mournful song. The cabin was warm and quiet. She was alone. For a panicked moment, she thought he had left her, but then she heard a sound from outside, the rhythmic, percussive thud of an axe splitting wood. She pushed herself up, her muscles aching in protest, and swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her feet, still wrapped, felt tender but whole. She crept to the window and peered out. The world was a sea of white. The snow drifted high against the cabin walls, and there, in a small, cleared area, was Elias McCrae. He was stripped to his woolen undershirt despite the biting cold, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching and releasing with each powerful swing of the axe. The pale, ethereal light of the winter dawn caught the scars on his face and arm, making them glow with a strange, silvery luminescence, like rivers on a map of some forgotten, war-torn country. His solitude was palpable. It was a frightening, immense thing. But as she watched him, she felt a sliver of something else entirely. It was not fear, it was a strange and unexpected sense of peace. The snow did not stop. For 3 days, it fell with a silent, relentless persistence, sealing the small cabin in a world of white and gray. The wind died down, but the snow kept coming, muffling all sound, burying the world under a thick blanket of quiet inside. The only sounds were the crackle and hiss of the fire in the hearth and the soft, measured breaths of 2 people trapped in an uneasy truce with solitude. Clara, accustomed to a life of purpose and routine, found the idleness maddening. She felt like a debt that needed repaying, a guest who had overstayed a welcome that was never truly offered. On the first morning, after a breakfast of strong coffee and dry biscuits, eaten in near-complete silence, she tried to make herself useful. She found a worn straw broom by the door and began to sweep the rough planked floor. Elias, who had been cleaning a snare trap by the fire, stopped his work. "Leave it," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It is no trouble," she replied, forcing a polite smile. "I cannot just sit here while you—" He rose to his full, intimidating height and walked over, taking the broom from her hands. His fingers brushed hers for a fraction of a second, and she felt a jolt, not of fear, but of the coarse, calloused texture of his skin. He did not seem to notice. "I will do it," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He set the broom back in its place and returned to his work, his message clear. This was his space, his routine. She was an intruder in it. She tried again later, offering to wash the tin plates and mugs from their meal. He took them from her before she reached the water basin. She offered to mend a tear in one of his shirts. He told her he had no needle and thread, though she saw a small sewing kit on a high shelf. Each attempt she made to bridge the distance between them with a simple act of domestic kindness was met with a gruff, unyielding wall. He was not being cruel. He was simply a man so accustomed to his own self-sufficiency that the very idea of accepting help felt like a violation. Kindness was a language he no longer spoke, and he seemed suspicious of anyone who tried to teach it to him. So she retreated. She sat on the small stool he had given her near the fire, her hands folded in her lap, feeling as useless as a ship in a bottle. She watched him. She observed the economy of his movements, the way he performed his daily chores with a practiced, unhurried efficiency. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man perfectly in tune with his surroundings. He could skin a rabbit, sharpen an axe, and bank a fire with a precision that was almost graceful. He was a creature of the wilderness, and she, with her soft hands and city manners, was a tame thing brought unwillingly into his den. By the second day, the silence had begun to change. It was no longer a heavy, awkward weight, but something more settled, more breathable. They had developed a rhythm that did not require words. He would tend the fire. She would read from the single book she had brought with her in her satchel, a worn copy of poems by Mr. Longfellow. Sometimes, she would catch him looking at her, his pale gray eyes holding a flicker of something she could not name. Curiosity, perhaps. Or maybe he was just wondering when the snow would stop so he could be rid of her. The first crack in the wall of silence came over a meager supper of stewed venison. She had been staring into the fire, her thoughts 1,000 miles away in the gas-lit drawing rooms of St. Louis. "You are a long way from home." "School teacher," he said, his voice startling her. She looked up, surprised he had initiated a conversation. "Yes," she said quietly. "I suppose I am." "This is hard country," he continued, not looking at her, his gaze fixed on the flames. "It is no place for a woman like you." A spark of defiance flickered within her. "And what kind of woman am I?" He finally turned his head, and his eyes met hers across the small space. "One who is not used to it." She could not argue with that. "I am learning," she said, her voice softer. There was nothing for me back east." He nodded slowly, accepting her answer without prying. Towns are cages of a different sort, he said, more to himself than to her. Too many eyes, too many tongues. The statement hung in the air between them, a shared truth they both understood intimately. Gossip is a cruel beast, Clara whispered. The memory of the St. Louis whispers still sharp as glass in her mind. It feeds on unhappiness and leaves only bones behind. Elias gave a short, harsh grunt of agreement. It chews on a man's name until there is nothing left of the man himself. In that moment, they were no longer just a man and a woman in a cabin. They were two outcasts, two people who had been judged and condemned by the small-minded cruelty of others. They spoke for a little while longer, in simple, halting sentences, about what it meant to be forgotten, to live on the fringes. He spoke of the freedom of the mountains, and she spoke of the suffocation of the city. They were from different worlds, yet they had both arrived at the same desolate shore of loneliness. The third day brought a fragile intimacy. The storm outside had settled into a gentle, hypnotic snowfall. The cabin felt warmer, safer, as Elias was cleaning his rifle. Clara, emboldened by their conversation the night before, finally asked the question that had been haunting her. "The people in town," she began, her voice tentative. "They tell stories about you." He did not stop his work, but she saw his hands still for a second. "I imagine they do." "They say," she hesitated, unsure how to continue. "They speak of a fire, and of your brother." The silence that followed was so profound she could hear the blood pounding in her own ears. He carefully set down the rifle parts and the oilcloth. He stared into the fire, his broad back a wall of granite. She thought he would not answer, that she had pushed too far and shattered the delicate trust they had built. She was about to apologize when he finally spoke, his voice low and raspy, thick with the dust of unshed grief. "His name was Thomas," he said. "He was younger than me by 2 years, laughed all the time. He was meant to run the ranch. I was just the muscle." He paused, gathering the words from a place of deep pain. It was a dry summer. The hay in the barn was packed tight as a drum. We never knew how it started, a stray spark from a lantern. Maybe it went up like a torch. He turned his head slightly, and in the firelight, Clara could see the muscles in his jaw working. "I was outside, at the well. I heard him scream. I ran in. The smoke, it was like a living thing, hot and black, choking everything. I found him in the back. A fallen beam had pinned his legs. I tried to lift it. It was too heavy. The fire was all around us. The roar of it was like the devil himself was laughing." His own scarred hand came up and touched the side of his face, an unconscious gesture. "I kept trying to lift it. My clothes were on fire. The heat, I could feel my skin melting. Thomas, he told me to go, to save myself. He was screaming it. But he was my brother. How could I leave him?" A tear traced a clean path through the grime on Clara's cheek. The main roof beam groaned. I knew it was about to go. I gave the beam one last try, put everything I had into it. It did not budge. The last thing I remember is Thomas looking at me, and the whole world turning into fire and noise and a pain so big I thought it had split me in two. His voice broke on the last words, a raw, ragged sound of agony. When I woke up, I was lying in the yard. Someone had dragged me out. The barn was gone, and Thomas was in it. He fell silent. The story, told in his simple, broken words, was 1,000 times more powerful than the town's cruel fantasies. It was not a tale of murder, but of love and failure and unbearable loss. "The town decided what happened," he said, his voice flat and dead. "They said we had argued over the ranch, that I left him in there. It was easier than believing a man could try so hard to save his brother and still fail. Easier to make me a monster than to admit that sometimes things just burn." The cabin was quiet, save for the soft crackle of the fire. Clara's heart ached for him, for the boy of 20 who had walked into a fire to save his brother and walked out a monster in the eyes of the world. She saw now that the scars on his face were nothing compared to the ones he carried inside. Seeing his raw, unguarded pain gave her the courage to unburden herself of her own. "I know something of being blamed," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "My husband, Arthur, he was a good man. Or, I thought he was. He was charming and full of life. But he had a sickness, the gambling. He hid it from me. By the time I found out, we were ruined. He owed everyone." She looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. "One night, he kissed me good night, told me he loved me, and in the morning, I found him in his study. He had ended it. He left a note, asking for forgiveness. But the world does not forgive a woman whose husband takes the coward's way out. They whispered that I had driven him to it, that my ambitions were too great, that I had spent all his money. His family blamed me. Our friends, they stopped calling. I was a pariah, the wife of a suicide. It was a stain that would not wash out." She finally looked up and met Elias's gaze. In his eyes, she saw not pity, but a profound and solemn understanding. He had been burned by fire, and she had been burned by shame. Both had been left scarred, ostracized, and utterly alone. In that small, snowbound cabin, two people judged by the world found a strange and solemn comfort in the ruins of each other's lives. That night, she could not sleep. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing, orange embers, casting a soft, warm light throughout the cabin. Elias sat on his stool, staring into the embers, lost in thought. He must have believed she was asleep. For the first time, he was not guarded. His shoulders, usually held so tense and high, were slumped. His face, turned toward the light, was a study in sorrow. The glow of the embers softened the harsh ridges of his scars, filling the hollows with a gentle shadow. She saw them fully now, without the barrier of daylight or his own self-consciousness. They were not ugly. They were a testament. They spoke of his pain, of his survival, of the love that had driven him into the flames. They were a part of him, as much as his quiet strength and his weary gray eyes. He must have sensed her watching him, for he turned his head. Their eyes met in the dim light. He stiffened immediately, a wave of shame and self-consciousness washing over his features. He started to turn away, to hide his ruined side in the shadows as he always did. But Clara held his gaze. She did not flinch. She did not recoil in horror or look away in pity. She simply looked at him, at all of him, and her expression was one of quiet, sorrowful acceptance. In her eyes, he was not a monster. He was just a man who had suffered. The moment stretched, silent and profound. It was a conversation without words, an offering of understanding that went deeper than any language. It was a small, fragile seed of affection being planted in the frozen ground of two lonely hearts. He was the one who finally broke the gaze, turning back to the fire. But something inside him had shifted. The iciest wall around his heart had begun to melt. The next morning, the world was transformed. The snow had stopped. A brilliant, blinding sun shone from a crystal blue sky, turning the landscape into a panorama of glittering diamonds. The spell was broken. The world outside had returned, and with it, the necessity of her departure. "The storm has passed," Elias announced, his voice back to its usual gruffness, though she could hear a new, underlying note of reluctance. "I will fix your wagon." They spent the morning in the sharp, clean air, working together. He crafted a new axle from the trunk of a young pine, his axe and knife moving with incredible skill. Clara helped where she could, gathering his tools, holding the wood steady. The physical work was a relief, a way to avoid the complicated emotions that now hung between them. He was once again the capable, solitary mountain man, and she was the schoolteacher he had rescued. But it was a role that no longer fit either of them comfortably. By midday, the buckboard was mended. As sturdy as before, it was time to go. She stood before him, the borrowed horse he had found and tethered for her standing patiently nearby. The words felt clumsy and inadequate. "I do not know how to thank you, Elias," she said, her voice thick. "You saved my life." He simply nodded, his gaze fixed on a point over her shoulder. "Be more careful on the trail." "I will not forget this," she insisted, wanting him to understand the depth of her gratitude. "Your kindness." The word hung in the air. Kindness. It was something he had likely not been accused of in a decade. A faint color rose on his unscarred cheek. He gave another curt nod, unable to reply. She climbed onto the buckboard, her heart heavy with a strange mix of relief and sorrow. She wanted to say more, to tell him that she saw the man, not the scars, but the words would not come. She clucked to the horse, and the wagon lurched forward, its wheels crunching in the deep snow. As she rode away, Elias stood on the ridge, a powerful, solitary figure against the vast, white canvas of the mountains. He watched her go, a small, dark shape shrinking in the distance, until she was swallowed by the pines. He did not move for a long time after she was gone. A cold wind swept down from the peaks, but it was not as cold as the sudden, aching emptiness in his cabin. In his chest, it was a pain he had not felt in years, a hurt he had thought himself long immune to. It was the pain of something lost. Miles down the trail, where the valley opened up, Clara pulled the horse to a stop. She turned and looked back. She could no longer see the cabin, but she could see the high ridge where it stood, a dark line of trees against the snow-dusted peaks. It no longer looked like a hostile, alien place. It was a part of the landscape that now held a human story, a point of warmth in the vast, cold wilderness. The world no longer felt entirely lonely. She knew that he was up there, and that, somehow, made all the difference. She turned back toward Bighorn Ridge, her journey home feeling less like a return to safety and more like a departure. Returning to Bighorn Ridge was like waking from a strange, intense dream into a reality that was both familiar and utterly alien. The town, with its muddy street, false-fronted buildings, and curtain-twitching windows, felt smaller and more confining than Clara remembered. The air, thick with the smells of coal smoke and manure, felt heavy and hard to breathe after the clean, sharp scent of pine and snow on the mountain. She resumed her duties at the schoolhouse, the routine of lessons and recitations a welcome anchor in a sea of dislocation. But as she stood before her students, her mind would often drift back to a small, warm cabin, the sound of an axe splitting wood, and a pair of weary, pale gray eyes. It did not take long for the whispers to begin. Her return, alive and unharmed after 3 days lost in a blizzard in the mountain man's territory, was a miracle that the town could not accept at face value. Miracles were simple things, spoken of from the pulpit on Sunday. This was complicated and messy, a story that pricked at the town's deepest fears and prejudices. At the general store, conversations would halt when she entered, resuming in hushed, urgent tones the moment she passed. She caught fragments, snippets of speculation that turned her stomach. "Jedediah at the livery says her horse came back alone, wild-eyed. 3 nights she was up there, 3 nights with him, and she came back without a scratch on her. It is not natural." The women were the worst. They looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and a strange, prurient curiosity, their eyes dissecting her for any sign of corruption or shame. They saw her survival not as a feat of endurance or a stroke of luck, but as a transaction. She must have paid a price for the monster's protection. Clara held her head high, her expression a carefully constructed mask of serene indifference. She would greet her accusers with a polite, "Good morning, Mrs. Gable," or a nod to the men who fell silent at her approach. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her pain, but in the lonely quiet of her rented room at night, the mask would crumble. The whispers echoed in her ears, and the weight of her isolation felt heavier than ever. She had never felt so alone. Not even when she was a pariah in St. Louis. Deep down, in a place she was almost afraid to acknowledge, she missed the quiet company of Elias McCrae. In his presence, she had felt seen, understood. In Bighorn Ridge, she was merely an object of speculation, a puzzle to be solved and discarded. The town's prejudice finally found its voice one afternoon in a woman named Martha Slocum, the saloon keeper's wife. Martha was a woman whose face was perpetually soured by judgment, her thin lips pursed as if tasting something foul. Clara was leaving the mercantile when Martha, standing with a group of other women, called out to her, her voice loud enough for half the street to hear. "Well, if it is not the school teacher, we were all so worried about you. Dear, it is a blessing you were returned to us." The words were honeyed, but the intent was pure venom. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Slocum," Clara replied evenly, refusing to take the bait. "Oh, we are all just amazed at your resilience," Martha continued, stepping forward. "To spend so much time in the company of that creature and come away unharmed. He must have taken quite a liking to you. One wonders what you did to earn such gentle treatment from a beast." The other women tittered nervously. Clara's face remained impassive, but a cold knot of fury tightened in her stomach. "Mr. McCrae is a good man who saved my life," she said, her voice low and steady. "I owe him a debt of gratitude. Not an explanation to you." Martha's face hardened, her pretense of concern dropping away. "A good man, the man who killed his own brother. Do not be a fool. Child, we all know what happens to a lone woman in the clutches of a man like that. You are no better than one of the girls my husband employs. At least they are honest about their trade." The insult, so public and so vile, struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. The street seemed to fall silent. She could feel every eye on her, hungry for the drama, waiting for her to break. But she would not. She looked Martha Slocum directly in the eye, her gaze clear and unwavering. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, her back straight, her steps measured, each one a victory against the urge to run. She did not see the man leaning against the assayer's office across the street, a ranch foreman named Hank Willis. Hank was a handsome man in a rugged, sun-beaten way, with a cocksure swagger and a reputation for getting what he wanted. He had made it known since Clara's arrival that he had his eye on her, tipping his hat to her on the street and making clumsy attempts at conversation. He saw her as a prize, the refined lady schoolteacher who would lend him an air of respectability. He had just been about to cross the street to offer her his sympathies and his protection when Martha Slocum had launched her attack. He watched as Clara met the insult with a dignity that stunned him, and he watched as she walked away. Her rejection of the town's judgment felt, in some strange way, like a rejection of him, and a hot flicker of resentment took root in his chest. Up on the mountain, Elias knew nothing of this. His life returned to its solitary rhythm, but the silence of his cabin now felt different. It was filled with the ghost of her presence. He would find a single, long strand of her dark hair on the wool blanket, or catch a faint, lingering scent of lavender from the furs where she had slept. He had pushed her from his world, but he had not been able to push her from his mind. He told himself it was for the best. He was a poison, a curse. Anyone who came near him was tainted by it. She was better off away from him, safe in the town. He was a fool to think otherwise. His quiet life was interrupted a few weeks later. He was checking a trap line deep in the woods that bordered the valley when he heard a sound that did not belong, the thin, terrified sobbing of a child. He followed the sound to a small, rocky ravine. There, huddled at the bottom, was a little boy, no older than 7 or 8. His face was streaked with dirt and tears, and one of his legs was bent at an unnatural angle. It was Jacob, the blacksmith's son, one of Clara's students. Elias had seen him in town, a bright, curious boy who sometimes stared at him with wide, unafraid eyes. "Easy now, son," Elias said, his voice a low, gentle rumble as he slid down the side of the ravine. The boy's eyes widened in terror at the sight of Elias's scarred face. He scrambled backward, crying out, "No, stay away! You are the monster!" The words were a familiar knife in his gut. But Elias's expression did not change. He held up his hands, showing they were empty. "I am not going to hurt you," he said softly. "I saw your tracks. You have been wandering for a while. Your family will be worried." He knelt down, moving slowly so as not to frighten the boy further. "Looks like you took a nasty fall. Let me see that leg." The boy, exhausted and in pain, hesitated for a moment, then allowed Elias to examine him. The leg was broken, a clean snap of the shin. Elias's hands, so strong they could split a log with one blow, were incredibly gentle as he straightened the limb. He tore strips from his own shirt to fashion a crude but effective splint, using 2 sturdy branches to hold it in place. The boy winced, but did not cry out again. He watched Elias with a dawning sense of wonder. This was not the actions of a monster. "There now," Elias said when he was finished. "That will hold you until the doc can set it proper." He stood and carefully lifted the boy into his arms. Jacob was light, a fragile bundle of bones. He wrapped his small arms around Elias's thick neck and buried his face in his shoulder. Elias carried him back toward Bighorn Ridge. As he emerged from the woods at the edge of town, a search party was just forming. Jacob's mother, Sarah, saw him first. A scream tore from her throat. "He has got my boy! The monster has got Jacob!" The men in the party, Hank Willis among them, raised their rifles. "Put the boy down! McCrae!" someone shouted. "Put him down now!" "He is hurt," Elias said, his voice carrying over the panicked shouts. "His leg is broken. I found him in the ravine." But they did not hear his words. They only saw the beast holding a child. Jacob's father, the blacksmith, a barrel-chested man named Peterson, pushed through the crowd. "Give me my son!" he roared, his face contorted with fear and rage. He snatched the boy from Elias's arms. "He saved me! Pa!" Jacob cried out, his small voice full of confusion. "I fell, and he fixed my leg!" No one listened. They crowded around the boy and his parents, leaving Elias standing alone, the object of their fear and hatred. "What were you doing with him in the woods?" someone demanded. "Were you going to eat him?" a cruel voice jeered. The insults rained down on him, sharp and ugly. It was then that the schoolhouse door opened, and Clara Hayes stepped out onto the porch. She had heard the commotion and had come to investigate. She took in the scene at a glance, the frightened parents clutching their son, the menacing circle of armed men, and Elias, standing isolated in the center of their scorn, his face an unreadable mask of stone. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice ringing with an authority that made several of the men shift uncomfortably. "He had the boy, Miss Hayes," Hank Willis said, stepping forward as if to protect her. "He took him—" "No!" Jacob's voice piped up. "He found me. He was carrying me home." Clara's gaze softened as she looked at the boy, then hardened as she turned back to the crowd. "Can you not see what has happened?" she said, her voice filled with a passion that silenced them. "This boy was lost and hurt, and this man you call a monster, brought him home safely. He did the same for me, when I was stranded in the blizzard. Elias McCrae saved my life. He is not a beast. He is a better man than any of you who stand here with your rifles and your cruel words. You should be ashamed of yourselves." A stunned silence fell over the crowd. They stared at her, this small woman with fire in her eyes, defending the town pariah. Jacob's mother had the decency to look ashamed, but most of the others just stared back with cold resentment. Hank Willis's face was dark with fury. To be chastised by her, in front of the whole town, while she defended that thing, was a humiliation he could not stomach. He looked from Clara's defiant face to Elias's scarred one and made a silent, venomous vow. Elias looked at Clara, a storm of emotion churning inside him. No one had ever defended him. No one had ever spoken a kind word for him in public. To see her standing there, a lone champion against the town's hatred, stirred something in his heart that he had long thought dead. Before the crowd could find its voice again, he turned without a word and melted back into the trees, leaving her to face the consequences of her courage. The consequences were immediate. The town's suspicion of her curdled into open hostility. She was now the monster's defender, an ally of the outcast. Parents threatened to pull their children from her school. Hank Willis, his pride wounded, began to spread his own poison, suggesting that her defense of Elias was proof of an unnatural relationship between them. Elisa was troubled. He had retreated to his mountain, but he could not escape the image of her standing on that porch, brave and alone. She had put herself in danger for him. He felt a powerful, protective urge, a need to do something, but he did not know how. He could not fight her battles in town. His presence only made things worse. So he began to visit at night, long after the town was asleep. He would slip down from the mountain like a shadow. He would chop and stack a neat pile of firewood by the schoolhouse door, enough to keep the potbelly stove roaring for a day or two. It was a simple, practical gesture, a silent message of gratitude and care. It was the only language he had. Clara knew it was him the first morning she found the wood. There was a precision to the way it was cut and stacked that spoke of his capable hands. A wave of warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire she would soon build. Each morning she found a new pile. She felt a little less alone. One evening, she took a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote a simple message. "Thank you. The fire is very warm." She tucked the note into a crevice in the woodpile before she left for the day. The next morning, the note was gone. A week later, she felt an overwhelming need to see him. She walked into the woods on the pretense of gathering pine cones for a children's art lesson. She followed the trail that led up the mountain, her heart beating a little faster with every step. She did not have to go far. He was there, waiting, as if he had known she would come. He was leaning against a large pine, and the dappled afternoon sunlight filtered through the branches, softening the lines of his face. The tension and awkwardness of their first encounter were gone, replaced by a quiet, comfortable tenderness. "I got your note," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I got your firewood," she replied with a small smile. They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the forest filling the space between them. "It was a brave thing you did," he said, his gaze serious. "In town, you should not have—" "Yes, I should have," she said firmly. "It was the truth, and the truth needed to be said." He looked down at his scarred hands. "You have made things harder for yourself. The town, they will not forgive you for taking my side." "Then let them not forgive me," she said, her voice full of a strength she did not know she possessed. "Their forgiveness is not something I want if it means I must be as blind and cruel as they are." He looked up at her then, and she saw a profound sadness and longing in his eyes. "Sometimes," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I dream of a life beyond this mountain, a place where a man is not judged by the scars on his face. But it is just a dream. I do not deserve it. My past, what I am, it cannot be washed away." His vulnerability was a raw, open wound, without thinking. Clara closed the small distance between them. She slowly raised her hand, her movements gentle so as not to startle him. He watched her, his breath hitched in his throat, as her fingers came to rest on the side of his face. He flinched at her touch, but did not pull away. Her fingertips were impossibly soft against the rough, ruined landscape of his skin. She did not trace the scars with morbid curiosity, but laid her hand there with a simple, profound acceptance. It was not a gesture of pity, but of reverence. She looked into his eyes, her own shining with an unshakable conviction. "You already earned your peace, Elias," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You earned it in the heart of a fire, trying to save your brother. Do not let them take that away from you, too." And in the quiet of the forest, with her hand on his face. He felt a lifetime of guilt and shame begin to loosen its grip. It was not forgiveness from God or from the town he had craved. He realized it was this, the simple, unconditional grace of one person's touch. Her touch had undone him. In the days that followed their meeting in the woods, Elias felt as if a thaw had begun deep inside him, a cracking of ice that had held his heart captive for a decade. Clara's whisper, "You already earned your peace," echoed in the silence of his cabin, a benediction he had never believed he would hear. The world, which had long been a thing of gray survival, began to show hints of color again. That quiet understanding became a fragile, unspoken pact between them. Clara began visiting the mountain regularly. Her official reason, announced with a careful casualness to her students and any prying ears in town, was to gather herbs and plants for nature lessons. She would set out on Saturday mornings with a large wicker basket, her face set with the determined expression of a teacher on a botanical quest. But the herbs were just a pretense, a shield for the true purpose of her journey. Her path always led to the clearing near Elias's cabin. He would be waiting for her. He never said as much, but she knew. He would emerge from the trees as she approached, a quiet, solid presence that made her heart settle in her chest. Their first few meetings were filled with a gentle, hesitant innocence. They would share a simple meal of roasted rabbit and strong, black coffee by his fire. The long silences between them were no longer awkward, but filled with a comfortable, shared intimacy. They spoke of small things, the changing weather, the tracks of a fox he had seen that morning, a particularly bright student in her class. Slowly, they became each other's teachers. He took her into the deep woods and showed her a world she had never known existed. He taught her how to read the story of the forest floor, the sharp, cloven print of a deer, the delicate tracings of a field mouse. He showed her which mushrooms were safe to eat and which roots held medicine. His hands, which she had once viewed with fear, became instruments of incredible knowledge as he patiently showed her how to set a simple snare, his large fingers guiding her smaller ones. He moved through the wilderness with a profound reverence, a man at peace in a world that the town below saw only as a threat. In return, she brought him the world of letters. She learned that while Elias could read well enough for practical purposes, the labels on tins, the brand on a sack of flour, his connection to the written word was tenuous. She brought her book of poetry, and in the evenings, by the soft glow of a tallow lamp, she would read to him. Then, she would have him read back to her. His voice, usually a low rasp, would soften as he struggled with the unfamiliar cadence of the verses. His brow furrowed in concentration. She brought him a slate and a piece of chalk, and taught him to form his letters with a slow, deliberate precision. His handwriting, like the man himself, was strong and unadorned, but it was clear and true. These lessons, both in the woods and by the fire, were more than an exchange of skills. They were an exchange of souls. In teaching her to track, he was sharing the core of his identity, the world where he was not a monster, but a master. In teaching him to write, she was giving him a voice, a tool to connect with a world that had long since silenced him. One clear, cold night, after a shared meal, they stood outside the cabin, watching the stars. The sky was a vast sweep of black velvet, punctured by a million diamond-sharp points of light. It was overwhelming, magnificent, and humbling. "I tried to learn their names once," Elias said, his voice a low murmur. "From a book. The hunter, the bear. It is hard to make them stick." Clara smiled. "My father taught me," she said, pointing a finger upward. "See that one? The one that looks like a pot? That is the Big Dipper." She traced its shape in the air. "And if you follow the two stars at the end of the pot, they point you to that bright one, all by itself." "The North Star," he said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "That is right," she said, pleased. "And over there," she turned, getting carried away in her lesson. and her foot caught on an exposed root. She stumbled, letting out a small yelp, and would have fallen had Elias not reached out and caught her, his hands steadying her by the arms. "Careful," he rumbled, his voice close to her ear. She looked up at him, her heart suddenly hammering in her chest. "I am so clumsy," she said, a nervous laugh bubbling up. "Teaching you to read the stars, and I cannot even read the ground at my own feet." A strange sound escaped his lips, a rough, rusty chuckle he seemed to swallow as soon as it came out. But it was too late. The absurdity of the moment, the simple, unexpected humor of it, struck them both. A real laugh escaped him then, a deep, rumbling sound from his chest that he could not contain. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard, and hearing it, seeing the lines around his eyes soften and the corner of his unscarred lip curl upward, she began to laugh too, a bright, clear sound of pure, unadulterated joy. They stood there for a long moment under the vast, silent canopy of stars and laughed. Two people who had forgotten what happiness felt like, rediscovering it together. It was the first time either of them had truly laughed in years. When their laughter subsided, a new awareness settled between them, potent and charged. He was still holding her arms. The small space between their bodies hummed with a sudden, intense heat. His smile faded, replaced by something deeper, more vulnerable. Her own laughter died in her throat. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them, bathed in starlight. One of his hands slid from her arm, and his thumb gently brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek. Her skin tingled where he touched her. Their eyes locked, and in his gaze she saw a desperate, aching longing that mirrored her own. He leaned in, his scarred face drawing closer, and she lifted her chin to meet him, her eyes fluttering shut. And then, just as their lips were about to meet, he flinched as if burned. He dropped his hands and took a half-step back, the connection shattering. The cold night air rushed in to fill the space between them. He turned away, his broad back rigid with tension. "It is late," he said, his voice hoarse. "You should go, before it gets too dark." Clara stood frozen for a moment, her heart aching with the sharp sting of rejection. She saw the fear in his posture, the same fear she felt herself. They had built something so fragile, so precious. Here on this mountain, it was a sanctuary of quiet understanding, to introduce passion, to risk the wild, unpredictable territory of a man and a woman. Felt like a danger that could shatter their delicate peace. Without another word, she picked up her basket and fled back down the trail, leaving him alone with the silent stars. Both of them terrified of the very thing they wanted most. Their fear was well-founded, for while they were building their fragile world on the mountain, the world below was busy tearing it down. As winter finally loosened its grip and the first green shoots of spring pushed through the muddy soil, the town's gossip thawed and began to flow with a renewed, vicious energy. Hank Willis, his pride still smarting from Clara's public defense of Elias, had spent the winter nursing his grudge. Her continued Saturday excursions up the mountain were an open secret, a weekly reminder of his humiliation. He took it upon himself to give the town's whispers a darker, more definitive shape. He started in the saloon, his voice low and conspiratorial over glasses of whiskey. "It is not right," he would say to the other ranchers and townsmen. "A decent woman, a school teacher, spending her days and who knows what else up there with that beast. She is not gathering herbs, I can tell you that." He would hint at things he had seen, lies spun from the whole cloth. He told them he had seen her going into the cabin at dusk and not coming out again. He described her as being under the beast's spell, painting a lurid picture of a depraved and unnatural relationship. The lie was simple, ugly, and effective. It gave a name to the town's fear, and it grew with every telling. Soon, it was accepted as fact. The schoolteacher was living with the monster. The inevitable summons came on a bright, deceptively cheerful spring afternoon. Mr. Abernathy. The proprietor of the general store and the head of the three-man school board requested her presence. The meeting was held in the back room of the mercantile, a stuffy, airless space that smelled of dust and dried beans. Mr. Abernathy, the blacksmith Mr. Peterson, and another rancher named Silas Croft sat behind a large table, their faces grim and self-important. They were the arbiters of morality in Bighorn Ridge. "Miss Hayes," Mr. Abernathy began, not meeting her eyes, "we have asked you here today to discuss a matter of some delicacy. A matter of public decency is what it is." "Mr." Peterson grumbled, his large hands clenched into fists on the table. Clara stood before them, her hands clasped, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She knew what this was about. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice calm and clear, "if you have something to say to me, please say it plainly." Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat. "It has come to our attention. It is the talk of the town. In fact, that you have been consorting with the man McCrae regularly." "I have been visiting Mr. McCrae. Yes," she admitted, seeing no reason to lie. "He is my friend." "Friend?" Silas Croft scoffed, a look of disbelief on his face. "A woman like you does not befriend a thing like that. People are saying you are living with him, that you are his woman." The ugly words hung in the cramped room. Clara felt a hot flush of anger and shame. What people say is a lie, a vicious, hateful lie spun by ignorant and fearful minds. Elias McCrae is a kind and honorable man who has shown me more decency than anyone in this town, yourselves included. Her defiance only hardened them. "That is beside the point." "Mr. Abernathy said, his tone growing colder. "You are the schoolteacher. You are meant to be an example of moral rectitude to our children. Your association with this person has created a scandal. Whether the rumors are true or not, the damage is done. Parents are threatening to pull their children from your class." "So the truth does not matter?" she asked, her voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "Only the lies of a gossip like Hank Willis?" "We cannot have a scandal attached to our school," Mr. Abernathy said, his voice final. "The board has voted. You are suspended from your teaching duties, effective immediately. Your position is terminated. You will be paid through the end of the week." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Terminated, suspended, her job, her purpose, the one thing that had kept her anchored, was gone. They had believed the lie. They had chosen prejudice over truth. She stared at the three men, at their closed, judgmental faces, and she felt the last of her ties to Bighorn Ridge snap. She did not cry, not there. She turned on her heel and walked out of the store, past the curious, staring faces on the street, and went straight to the livery. She saddled the horse she rented, her movements jerky and numb. There was only one place to go, only one person who would understand. She rode hard, tears blurring her vision, the rhythmic pounding of the horse's hooves a match for the frantic beating of her heart. She was choking on a toxic cocktail of shame, fury, and a grief so profound it felt like it would tear her in two. She had lost everything, all over again. She burst into the clearing near his cabin like a storm. Elias was outside, splitting firewood, and he looked up, his face etched with concern at the sight of her tear-streaked face and the frantic heaving of her horse. "Clara, what is it? What is wrong?" he asked, dropping the axe and moving toward her. "They fired me," she sobbed, sliding from the saddle into his arms, her carefully constructed composure completely shattered. "The school board, they suspended me because of the lies. Elias, the horrible things they are saying about us." He held her, his arms wrapping around her trembling body, his expression hardening into a mask of cold fury. He led her inside and sat her down by the hearth, his movements gentle despite the rage simmering within him. He listened as she told him everything, the words tumbling out between sobs, the rumors, Hank Willis, the cold, sanctimonious faces of the school board. When she finished, a heavy silence fell. He stared into the fire, his jaw tight, his scarred face a landscape of torment. "This is my fault," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper of self-loathing. "I knew this would happen. I bring ruin to everything I touch. I am a curse. Clara." He stood up and began to pace the small cabin like a caged animal. "You have to leave," he said, his back to her. "Not just this mountain. You have to leave Bighorn Ridge. Go back east. Go somewhere they do not know you, where my shadow cannot fall on you. You can start again. Be safe." His words were like a slap. After everything, after the town had cast her out, he was doing it too. He was sending her away. The grief and shame inside her ignited into pure, white-hot fury. "Safe!" she shrieked, jumping to her feet. "You want me to go back there to be safe? The only place I have ever felt unsafe is in that town, with its whispers and its judgments and its cruel, narrow hearts. The only place I have ever felt safe in my entire life is right here, with you." Her shout echoed in the small cabin, a raw, desperate cry of truth. It shattered the last of his defenses. He turned slowly, his face a maelstrom of shock, pain, and a desperate, burgeoning hope. He saw her standing there, defiant and broken, her eyes blazing, and he knew she was right. He had been so consumed with the idea that he was her ruin. He had not understood that he was also her sanctuary. He crossed the room in 2 long strides. He reached out, his hands tentatively cupping her face, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "Clara?" he whispered, his voice thick with a decade of unspoken longing. That was all it took. The dam of their restraint, of their fear and caution, finally broke. She surged forward, her arms wrapping around his neck, and he met her halfway, his powerful arms encircling her waist, pulling her tight against him until there was no space left between them. It was not a gentle embrace. It was a collision, a desperate, frantic coming together of 2 people who had been starved of comfort and affection for far too long. It was the embrace of the lost finding their home, of the broken finding the one person who could make them whole. Months of silence, of stolen glances, of shared laughter and unspoken desire poured out in that one breathless, desperate moment. A release so powerful it left them both shaking. He held her as if he would never let her go, his face buried in her hair, breathing in her scent. She clung to him, her tears soaking his shirt, her heart finally at peace. They had found each other. But even as they stood locked in that cathartic embrace, a new danger was stirring. Far below, on the trail that led from Bighorn Ridge into the mountains, 3 riders urged their horses onward. At their head was Hank Willis, his face a mask of grim determination. He and 2 men from the saloon, fueled by whiskey and self-righteousness, were riding toward the mountain. They were riding for the beast's lair. They were riding for her. Their embrace was not an end to the storm, but the calm eye in the center of it. In the days that followed, the world outside the mountain, the town with its cruel tongues, the school board with its righteous condemnation seemed to fade, becoming a distant, unimportant noise. Their sanctuary was the cabin and the small patch of wilderness around it, and within its borders, they began to build a life. It was a life measured not in days or weeks, but in small, quiet happinesses. They became a study in shared rhythms. In the mornings, they would walk to the stream, Elias with his fishing line, Clara with her water pail. He taught her how to cast the line just so, to feel the subtle tug of a trout nosing the bait. She would laugh with a pure, uninhibited delight when she finally caught one, its silver body flashing in the sun. They worked together to repair a section of the cabin roof that had been damaged by the winter storms, their hands often brushing as they passed shingles or tools, each touch a small, grounding comfort. Clara, a woman who had once known only city gardens with their manicured rose bushes, discovered a deep and abiding pleasure in the soil, together. They cleared a small plot of land near the cabin, turning the dark, rich earth. They planted seeds she had bought in town, beans, squash, and corn, and she tended the nascent sprouts with a fierce, maternal devotion. For Elias, watching her kneel in the dirt, a smudge of soil on her cheek and her face lit with a peaceful contentment, was a miracle he had never dared to imagine. She was bringing life not just to the barren ground, but to the barren landscape of his own soul. He began to change. The haunted, watchful look in his eyes began to recede, replaced by a quiet warmth. The lines of pain around his mouth and eyes softened. He was still a man of few words, but he learned to speak with his hands. He started a project, working in the evenings by the firelight, a small block of aspen wood in his lap. He would not let her see what it was, turning it over in his hands, his knife moving with a slow, loving precision. He was carving away not just the wood, but the layers of his own guilt and shame. He was, for the first time in 10 years, creating something not for survival, but for beauty. He was beginning to believe in redemption. One evening, as the sun bled purple and orange behind the peaks, he pressed the finished object into her hand. It was a hair comb, carved from the pale, smooth wood. The top was adorned with the delicate, intertwined shapes of 2 pine branches, a testament to the place that had become their haven. It was a simple, humble thing, yet it was the most beautiful gift she had ever received.
"Elias,"
she whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she traced the smooth, polished tines. "For your hair," he said, his voice a low rumble. He reached out, his calloused fingers clumsy but gentle, and tucked it into the dark knot of her hair at the nape of her neck. It was an act of profound intimacy, a claim. He was no longer just her savior. He was her partner. She was no longer just a refugee. She was home. Their fragile peace was shattered 2 mornings later. They were weeding the garden, the sun warm on their backs, when a sound echoed up from the valley. A single gunshot, sharp and angry, tearing through the morning calm. It was followed by another. Elias straightened instantly, his entire body going rigid. He dropped his trowel and stared down the mountain trail, his face hardening into the grim, stony mask she had seen when she first met him. All the softness, all the newfound peace, vanished in an instant.
"What is it?"
Clara asked, her heart beginning to pound. "Trouble," he said, his voice flat and cold. "Get inside. Bar the door."
"Who?"
"Hank Willis," he said, his eyes like chips of granite.
"He has come."
He strode into the cabin and emerged a moment later with his heavy hunting rifle.
"Elias, no,"
she pleaded, grabbing his arm. "Do not meet them with violence." "They are the ones bringing it," he said, his gaze fixed on the trail. He checked the load in the rifle with a practiced, deadly efficiency. "I will not let them harm you. Go inside. Clara, now!" She saw the look on his face and knew it was useless to argue. She retreated into the cabin, her hands trembling, and slid the heavy wooden bar across the door. She peered through the small, grimy window, her breath catching in her throat. They appeared a few minutes later, 3 riders emerging from the trees. Hank Willis was in the lead, his face flushed with whiskey and righteous fury. Flanking him were 2 other men from the town, Jeb and Silas, their expressions a mixture of bravado and unease. They pulled their horses to a halt in the clearing, their eyes darting from the small, tidy garden to the silent, imposing figure of Elias, who stood before the cabin, rifle held loosely at his side. "McCrae!" Hank shouted, swinging down from his horse. "We know she is in there. Send her out." "You are not welcome here, Willis," Elias said, his voice dangerously low. "Turn around and ride back down." "Not until we have the schoolteacher," Hank sneered, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "We are here to rescue her from the beast who has her under his spell." He looked past Elias toward the cabin door. "Miss Hayes, Clara, We know you are a decent woman. You do not have to stay with this monster. He has you bewitched, but we can save you." The accusation was so absurd, so twisted, that for a moment Clara was speechless. Witchery. They had truly painted her as a helpless victim of some dark, monstrous enchantment. "She is here because she chooses to be," Elias said, taking a step forward. "This is her home. Now leave." "Her home?" Hank let out a cruel laugh. "This pigsty, with a murdering, scarred-up animal like you? I do not think so." He started to walk toward the cabin. "I am taking her back." "You will not take another step," Elias warned, raising the rifle. The sight of the weapon seemed to incite Hank further. "See?" he yelled to his men. "He keeps her here by force. He is a kidnapper." He drew his pistol. "Let her go, McCrae, or I will put you down like the dog you are." Everything happened at once. Hank lunged forward. Elias, unwilling to shoot, used his rifle as a club, swinging the heavy stock and catching Hank in the shoulder, sending him sprawling. At the same time, Jeb and Silas charged from the sides. Elias met them with a raw, primal force, a storm of fists and fury. He was bigger and stronger than both of them, but they were 2 to his 1. He threw Jeb to the ground, but Silas tackled him from behind, and they both went down in a tangle of limbs. From inside, Clara watched in horror. It was a brutal, ugly brawl. She saw Elias take a heavy blow to the face, but he answered with one of his own that sent Silas reeling. He was getting the better of them, his mountain-hardened strength too much for the 2 saloon brawlers. Then she saw Hank scrambling to his feet, his face a mask of hate, his pistol raised. "Elias!" she screamed. The world exploded in a deafening roar of gunpowder. Elias, who had just thrown Jeb aside, cried out and staggered back, clutching his chest. A dark red stain blossomed on his shirt, high on his left side. The fight went out of him. He stumbled and fell to one knee, his rifle clattering to the ground. Clara did not hesitate. She threw the bar from the door and ran out, screaming his name. She threw herself in front of him, creating a human shield with her own body. Facing Hank Willis with her arms spread wide. "No!" she cried, her voice cracking. "Stop it! Leave him alone!" Hank stared at her, his pistol still smoking, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fury. "Get out of the way, Clara! He is a monster! Can you not see?" "You are the monster!" she sobbed, tears streaming down her face. "You shot him! Please, for the love of God, just go!" Hank took a step toward her, his face twisting with obsession. "I am not leaving without you," he snarled, reaching out to grab her arm. "You are coming back with me." As his fingers closed around her wrist, something inside Clara snapped. All her fear, all her grief, coalesced into a single point of white-hot rage. With her free hand, she reached behind her, her fingers closing around the first solid thing they found, a heavy iron fire poker lying near the outdoor hearth. She swung it with all her might, the iron connecting with the side of Hank's head with a sickening thud. He grunted in pain and surprise, stumbling backward, his hand flying to his head. He stared at her, his eyes filled with disbelief. This was not the gentle, refined schoolteacher. This was a cornered she-cat, spitting and clawing to protect her own. Jeb and Silas, seeing their leader struck down and seeing the look of pure, unbridled fury on Clara's face, lost their nerve. "Let us go, Hank," Jeb stammered, grabbing his arm. "This ain't worth it." Hank allowed himself to be pulled away, his hateful gaze still locked on Clara and the wounded man she was protecting. "This is not over," he spat, blood trickling from his temple. "We are getting the sheriff. You will both hang for this." They scrambled onto their horses and galloped away, their threats echoing behind them as they disappeared into the trees. Clara did not watch them go. She turned and sank to her knees beside Elias. He was pale, his breathing shallow, the blood still seeping from the wound in his chest.
"Elias,"
she whispered, her hands hovering over the wound, afraid to touch him. "Oh, God, Elias!" He looked up at her, his gray eyes clouded with pain. "Clara," he rasped. You have to go. Leave me, before they come back with the sheriff. Save yourself." "Be quiet," she said, her voice choked but firm. She ripped a strip of cloth from the hem of her petticoat and pressed it firmly against the wound. "I am not going anywhere." With a strength she did not know she possessed, she helped him to his feet and half-dragged, half-carried him into the cabin and onto the bed of furs. The bullet had torn through the fleshy part of his upper chest, a ragged, ugly wound that was bleeding profusely. He was already beginning to burn with fever. He slipped in and out of consciousness, his words a jumble of guilt and fear. "My fault, always my fault. Should have stayed away. Ruined you." She worked tirelessly, her fear giving way to a steely resolve. She cleaned the wound as best she could with boiled water and whiskey. She bound it tightly with clean strips of cloth. She bathed his face and chest with cool water, trying to keep the fever from consuming him. She sat by his side all through the long, terrifying night, listening to his ragged breathing, holding his hand, whispering to him. "It is all right. Elias, I am here. I will not leave you." He was delirious, lost in a fevered dream of fire and judgment. He called out for his brother, Thomas, his voice filled with an agony that tore at her heart. She held on to him, her presence a solid, unwavering anchor in his storm of pain. As the first pale fingers of dawn crept through the window, his fever seemed to break, his breathing evened out, and he fell into a deep, healing sleep. Clara sat watching him, her body aching with exhaustion, her dress stained with his blood. She looked at his face, so peaceful in sleep, the scars softened by the gray light. The sheriff would come. They would take him. They might hang him, but they would not take him from her. She leaned down and whispered against his cheek, a vow made in the quiet of the new day.
"If they come for you, Elias,"
she said softly, her voice an unbreakable promise,
"they will have to take me too."
They did not have to wait long. 2 days later, a lone rider appeared in the clearing. It was the sheriff, a tall, weary-looking man named Brody with a drooping mustache and sad, intelligent eyes. Clara met him on the porch, a rifle held loosely in her hands. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. "I am Sheriff Brody. I am here to investigate a complaint made by Mr. Hank Willis."
"He is lying,"
Clara said, her voice steady.
"He and 2 other men came here. They attacked us. They shot Mr. McCrae."
The sheriff sighed, a long, tired sound. "That is not the story he is telling. He claims McCrae kidnapped you and that he shot in self-defense when he was attacked." He looked her over. "But I have been a sheriff for 20 years, Miss Hayes, and I have learned that the loudest story is not always the truest one." He paused. "I have also been talking to people in town. A lot of folks are talking about how you stood up for McCrae after he brought the Peterson boy back. And young Jacob Peterson, well, that boy cannot stop telling everyone how the mountain man was gentle and kind and saved him. A story like that, coming from a child, it carries weight." Clara's heart gave a small leap of hope. "It seems," the sheriff continued, "that Mr. Willis's reputation is not as sterling as he would like people to believe. And his 2 friends, after a night in my jail cell, remembered a version of events that sounds a lot more like yours than his. They admitted Willis was drunk and looking for a fight." Relief washed over Clara so powerfully her knees felt weak. "Hank Willis is under arrest for assault and inciting a riot," the sheriff said. "As for Mr. McCrae, as far as the law is concerned, he is cleared of any and all blame. He acted in defense of his home and himself. The words she had been praying for.
"He was safe. He was free."
"May I see him?" the sheriff asked. She led him inside. Elias was awake, propped up against the wall, his face pale but his eyes clear. The sheriff looked at the crude bandage on his chest, then at the tidy cabin, then at the fierce, protective way Clara stood beside the bed. He nodded slowly. "You rest up, McCrae," he said, his tone respectful. "The town owes you an apology, I reckon." He turned to leave, then stopped at the door. "For what it is worth, a few folks are starting to see things differently. You might find Bighorn Ridge a little more welcoming, should you ever decide to come down." After the sheriff left, a profound quiet settled over the cabin. The threat was gone. They had won. Clara turned to Elias, a radiant smile on her face. "Did you hear that? Elias, it is over. You are free." He looked at her, and she saw the deep soul weariness in his eyes. The haunted look was back. He had been cleared by the law, but he had not been cleared by himself. "I cannot face them. Clara," he whispered, his voice rough. "The town, their whispers, their stares, even if they are not hateful. I am not ready to be seen." Her smile faded. She understood. The bullet wound in his chest would heal, but the scars on his soul, the ones the town had carved into him for 10 long years, were far deeper. She went to his side and took his hand, her grip firm and steady. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Her presence was her answer. The world might have cleared his name, but his peace was not in the valley below. It was here, in this cabin, with her, and she would stay, quietly and patiently, for as long as it took for him to believe it. 2. The wound in Elias's chest healed, but the healing of a man's soul is a slower, more patient craft. As spring bled into a warm, verdant summer, the mountain came alive around them. The slopes exploded in a riot of color: Indian paintbrush, bluebells, and wild columbine. The air grew thick with the scent of pine and damp earth and the drowsy hum of bees. In this cocoon of renewed life, Clara and Elias began the quiet, deliberate work of turning his Spartan cabin into a home. They were a study in contrasts, a perfect partnership of his strength and her vision. He felled 2 tall pines and, with painstaking labor, hewed the logs into smooth planks. From these, they built a small porch on the front of the cabin, a place where they could sit in the evenings and watch the stars appear. Clara, wanting more light, drew a square on the west wall. "Can we have a window here?" she asked. The next day, he carefully cut the opening, and a week later, after a quiet, solitary trip to a trading post miles downriver, he returned with a pane of real glass, an unheard-of luxury. The first time the afternoon sun streamed through it, filling the cabin with golden light, Clara wept with a quiet, simple joy. They worked in the garden, their hands in the same soil. They fished in the stream, their laughter echoing in the clear mountain air. Slowly, painstakingly, they were building a life, not on the ruins of their pasts, but on a new foundation of shared peace. And then, a strange thing began to happen. The town, which had for so long been a source of pain, began to reach out. The first visitor was Mr. Peterson, the blacksmith, who rode up the mountain trail one Saturday afternoon leading a pack mule. He was a large, stoic man, and he stood in the clearing, twisting his hat in his hands, looking profoundly uncomfortable. "Ma'am," he said, nodding to Clara. "McCrae," he nodded to Elias, who stood silently beside her. "My boy, Jacob, he talks of you, of your kindness." He cleared his throat. "The wife, she sent a sack of flour and some sugar." He gestured to the mule. "And I heard you were building. I forged some new hinges and a proper latch for your door. A man's home ought to be secure." It was an apology, offered not in words, but in flour and sugar and hand-forged iron. Elias, stunned into silence, could only nod his thanks. It was Clara who invited Mr. Peterson to stay for a cup of coffee. And as the 3 of them sat on the new porch, a fragile, unspoken truce was formed. Others followed. The sheriff would sometimes ride up on his patrols, sharing news and a bit of tobacco with Elias. Mrs. Miller, from the homestead Clara had tried to reach during the blizzard, came with a basket of fresh eggs and a bundle of quilting scraps for Clara. She brought books, 2. Old novels with cracked spines, leaving them as a quiet offering. The town's fear, it seemed, could not long survive the stubborn, simple truth of a child's story and a woman's courage. The legend of the monster was dying, and in its place, a new story was taking root. A story of a quiet, scarred man who was capable of great gentleness. The children, when they saw Clara on her rare trips to the mercantile for supplies she could not make or grow, would ask her questions, their eyes wide with awe, not fear. "Miss Clara," they would whisper, "tell us about the man who saved Jacob." But the world's forgiveness is a simpler thing than a man's forgiveness of himself. Though the days were filled with a growing peace, the nights were sometimes long and dark. The ghosts of the fire still haunted Elias's dreams. There were nights when he would wake in a cold sweat, the smell of smoke in his nostrils, the phantom screams of his brother echoing in his ears. In these moments, his shame would return, a crushing weight that bowed his great shoulders. Clara would find him sitting by the cold hearth, his head in his hands. He would not look at her, his face a mask of old, familiar agony. "I do not deserve this," he would whisper, his voice raw. "I do not deserve you." On those nights, he would hide his scarred face in her hands, as if he could not bear for her to see the monster he still believed himself to be. Clara's love never wavered. She would not offer empty platitudes or easy reassurances. She would simply hold him, her small hands a warm, steady anchor in his sea of grief. She would hold him until the shaking subsided, until his breathing evened out, until he could once again believe in the man she saw, not the ghost that haunted him. Her love was a patient, creative thing. She discovered that the fire had left him with more than scars. The beam that had struck him had left his right leg with a permanent, subtle limp, a slight drag in his step that he tried to hide. It was a source of deep shame for him, a physical reminder of his failure. One evening, she hummed a soft waltz she remembered from her youth. "What is that?" he asked. "A song for dancing," she said, her eyes shining in the lamplight. "I do not dance," he stated, his voice flat. "Nonsense," she said gently. "Everyone can dance." She stood and held out her hands. "Come." He stared at her hands as if they were hot coals. "Clara, I cannot. My leg." "Then I will lean on you," she said simply. "And you will lean on me. That is how it works." She took his hands and pulled him to the center of the cabin. She put his hand on her waist and hers on his shoulder, and slowly, humming the tune, she began to lead him. At first, he was stiff and clumsy as an oak tree, his movements awkward, his shame palpable. But she did not let him go. She moved with him, accommodating his limp, making it part of the rhythm, part of their dance. Slowly, he began to relax. He began to follow her lead, his heavy boots shuffling on the wood floor. He looked down at her upturned, smiling face, and for the first time, he felt no shame in his brokenness. They were just two imperfect people, leaning on each other, moving as one in the warm, quiet light of their home. The summer ripened into the golden glow of early autumn. The aspen trees on the high slopes turned a brilliant, shimmering yellow, and the air grew crisp and clean. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long shadows and bathing the entire valley in a warm, honeyed light, Elias led Clara to a small, flat rock overlooking the stream. He was quiet for a long time, watching the water flow over the smooth stones. He had the wooden comb she loved so much in his hands, turning it over and over. When he finally spoke, his voice was clear and steady, devoid of the old ghosts of guilt. "When you first came here," he began, "I thought you were a storm that would wreck what little I had left. Then I thought you were a bird with a broken wing that I had to mend so you could fly away. I was wrong. You were the sun. You came through the window and lit up all the dark corners I had learned to live in." He turned to her, and the golden evening light filled his eyes, turning them the color of warm whiskey. "I spent 10 years trying to pay a debt for a life I could not save. I thought that was my purpose. You taught me that my purpose is not to beg for forgiveness, but to live a life worthy of the peace you have given me." He set the comb down and took both of her hands in his. They were strong, steady hands, the hands of a man who knew his own worth. "Clara Hayes," he said, his voice soft but sure. "I am not asking you to save me. I am asking you to let me spend the rest of my life loving you. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in her eyes, tears of a joy so pure and profound it felt like a prayer. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh, Elias, yes." Their wedding was not held in the church in Bighorn Ridge, with its judgmental pews and stern pulpit. Instead, they chose a small, sun-dappled meadow in the valley, halfway between the mountain and the town. It was a symbolic meeting place, a bridge between their two worlds. The town minister, a man whose face now held more compassion than condemnation, agreed to officiate. Only a few brave townspeople came. Sheriff Brody stood as Elias's witness, his sad eyes crinkling in a rare smile. Mr. and Mrs. Peterson were there, and the Miller family, and the children, a small group of them, led by Jacob, stood at a respectful distance, their faces scrubbed clean, watching with a solemn, wide-eyed wonder. They did not see a monster getting married. They saw their teacher, Miss Clara, radiant in a simple blue dress, and the quiet, gentle man who had saved their friend. Elias did not hide his face. He stood tall, his scarred cheek turned toward the sun, and spoke his vows in a clear, strong voice. When the minister pronounced them man and wife, he did not kiss her with the desperate, frantic need of their first embrace. He kissed her with a deep, tender reverence, a promise of 1,000 quiet sunrises and peaceful nights to come. The last scene of their story unfolds weeks later. As autumn deepens, the air is cool, and the setting sun has painted the sky in strokes of fiery orange and soft lavender. Elias and Clara are walking together along the ridge, their path lit by the day's last light. A gentle wind hums through the pines, a sound that is no longer lonely, but sounds like a contented sigh. Her hand rests on his chest, over his heart. He stops and turns to her, and the dying light catches the scars on his face. They are no longer a terrifying map of ruin. In the warm, alchemical glow of dusk, they shine with the soft, burnished luster of old gold, a testament not to what was lost in the fire, but to the man who had endured it. He looks at her, his love for her a vast, quiet ocean in his eyes. "You saw the man beneath the scars," he murmurs, his voice full of a peaceful wonder. She raises a hand and gently traces the oldest, deepest mark along his jaw. Her touch as light as a memory. A soft, knowing smile touches her lips. "I never saw anything else," she answers. And so they stand, two souls no longer defined by the fires that had forged them, but by the quiet, resilient love that had healed what the world had tried to destroy. Their future stretching before them as peaceful and promising as the star-dusted sky above the Montana wilderness. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers. And we invite you to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.